The torches shook in their fathers' trembling hands, as Rome's senators were ordered to hold the light steady, while their own daughters were fed to the emperor's hunger. This was not rumor. It was recorded, catalogued, and signed with the seal of Rome itself. You were never meant to hear this. The sound you are about to hear was never meant for human ears. Imagine a marble corridor in Rome, gleaming with torchlight, echoing with the measured footsteps of armored guards. But behind one gilded door, there is no triumph, no banquet, no laughter. Only screams, raw, tearing screams, rising and breaking against the cold stone walls. And in that moment, every father holding a torch outside knows he is no longer a man, no longer a protector, but a witness, complicit in the destruction of his own blood. Because Caligula, emperor of Rome, demanded not only the submission of bodies, but the annihilation of the human soul. What we call madness today was not chaos. It was order. Systematic. Calculated. Catalogued. He did not destroy families randomly, he turned it into state procedure. A ledger in the imperial archives, written in the same precise Latin used to count grain shipments, recorded girls as acquisitions. Age, parentage, purpose. Fathers stood frozen as scribes dipped their quills, converting daughters into numbers. This was not passion, it was empire. This was not desire, it was the machinery of absolute power grinding down the last resistance of human dignity. But you must understand, what happened in Caligula's palace was never just about him. It was not merely the indulgence of a sick ruler. It was a revelation of something darker, something empires have always known, that the surest way to control a society is not through its armies or its laws, but through the corruption of its most sacred bonds. Break the father before his daughter's eyes, invert the family, make love itself a tool of humiliation, and you no longer rule bodies, you own souls. Do not comfort yourself by thinking this is history. The marble has crumbled, the torches extinguished, but the principle has never died. Power is not about swords or coins, it is about redesigning reality so thoroughly that even the most unthinkable horrors can be applauded as divine. Caligula understood this. And in the shadows of his chambers, under the roar of thunder, he proved it. So the question is not why he did it. The question is, how did Rome allow it? How did senators who once swore oaths to protect their people become silent torchbearers to their daughters' destruction? That answer begins not with screams, but with cheers, the cheers of a city welcoming a young emperor they thought would save them. It began with hope. Rome had lived under the shadow of Emperor Tiberius for more than 2 decades. A man paranoid, cruel, hidden away on his island, ruling through fear and suspicion. When he died in 37 CE, the city breathed like a prisoner seeing daylight for the first time. His nephew, young, handsome, charming, stepped into power, and the people erupted. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. The soldiers called him Caligula, Little Boots, a nickname born from the miniature armor he wore as a child in his father's camps. To the people, he was the son of the beloved general Germanicus, the blood of Augustus himself. They believed Rome's golden age had returned. The first months confirmed their hopes. He granted bonuses to soldiers, abolished unjust taxes, threw grand games that spilled across weeks. The Senate whispered in delight, "At last, a Caesar who listens." The people shouted, "Our savior has arrived." Even hardened generals allowed themselves to dream. But empires are rarely destroyed by what you can see. They are undone by what hides in shadow. Within weeks, slaves began vanishing from the palace. First a serving girl. Then 2 kitchen workers. Their bodies floated days later in the Tiber, marked with wounds no wild beast could explain. Rumors flickered like candlelight, but no one dared speak them. After all, Rome had prayed for this man. He was the hope of the empire. Hope blinds. 6 months into his reign, the young emperor collapsed with a violent illness. Fever consumed him. The empire froze in dread, temples filled with offerings, priests chanting night and day. Citizens slaughtered cattle in desperation, begging the gods to spare him. And when he recovered, the people wept with joy. But his eyes, they were different. Suetonius wrote, he returned as something not human. His brush with death had not humbled him. It had convinced him he was divine. From that moment, mortal rules no longer applied. Senators' wives were invited to private dinners, an invitation that could not be refused. Young boys from noble families were honored with palace positions, their cheeks rouged and clothed in silk. Yet still, Rome excused it. He is young, they said. He will learn. But power does not mature. It metastasizes. Caligula was not learning. He was constructing. Quietly replacing guards with men chosen for cruelty. Appointing a master of pleasures whose task was to procure anything, anyone, at any time. And in the summer of 38 CE, the first ledger appeared in the imperial archives, not of taxes, not of grain, but of human acquisitions. A new economy had begun, the economy of flesh. And this was only the beginning. At first, the entries in the ledger seemed almost random. A merchant's daughter here. A visiting dignitary's wife there. Names, ages, physical descriptions, written in the same detached hand used to record bushels of grain. But patterns soon emerged. The ledgers revealed more than victims. They revealed strategy. Caligula understood something sinister. True domination is not achieved by seizing strangers. It is achieved by destroying what others hold sacred. The senator who challenged his tax reforms suddenly saw his daughter's name inked into the imperial archives. The general who questioned his military plans was summoned, not to defend Rome's borders, but to witness the public degradation of his wife. Punishment was no longer exile or execution. That was merciful, too swift. The emperor's cruelty demanded more. It demanded that men watch the slow dismantling of everything they loved. The palace itself became an instrument of this destruction. Architects received strange orders. New chambers built with precise acoustics so that screams would echo into waiting rooms, forcing future victims and fathers to hear what awaited them. Torch holders installed at perfect heights so that a father's trembling hand would always cast full light on his child's torment. Even the marble floors were polished to reflect every movement, ensuring that what the eyes wished to forget would return again and again in ghostly shimmer. This was not chaos. It was ritual. By early 39 CE, Rome understood. The man they had celebrated was no man at all, but a self-proclaimed god who demanded worship through humiliation. In public banquets, he no longer concealed his perversions. Before 300 senators, he placed his hand upon his sister Drusilla and announced she was blessed by Jupiter himself to share my affection as Juno shares his. The senators froze. They knew the mythology. Jupiter married his sister. Caligula had weaponized Rome's religion itself. Applause or silence, both meant complicity. And so they applauded. The other sisters, Julia Livilla and Agrippina the Younger, lowered their eyes to their wine cups, already knowing what was to come. They too would be forced into the theater of divine incest, their humiliation staged as state ritual. By turning his sisters into symbols of religious authority, Caligula rewrote morality itself. What had once been unthinkable became unchallengeable. Every senator in attendance understood the message. If I can do this to my own blood, imagine what I can do to yours. And Rome, bound by fear, began to whisper in shadows, was this madness, or genius? The empire that once prided itself on law, order, and civilization now documented human suffering with bureaucratic precision. In the hands of Caligula's appointed master of accounts, Sabinus, the palace ledgers became something far more sinister than records. They became blueprints for industrialized torment. Each page reduced flesh and blood to cold categories: age, origin, physical features, family ties, compliance rating. A young girl wasn't a daughter. She was property, female, 14. Acquired for divine service. A senator's wife was, inventory, age 31, processing. Even the word processing had been twisted into horror. It meant systematic breaking of resistance until the human spirit fractured into obedience. But Sabinus's genius wasn't only in cataloging. It was in monetization. Caligula had realized that what he demanded for pleasure could also serve as revenue. A new tax was devised, the vectigul ex capturis, a levy on forced service. The state profited from every act of degradation. The numbers spoke their own language. First quarter of 39 CE, 2,000 denarii. Second quarter, 8,000. Third, 15,000. A curve of exponential growth, not in trade or conquest, but in broken lives. This was not cruelty, it was economy. The machinery of Rome had been turned inward, its infrastructure for aqueducts, roads, and legions repurposed into the trafficking of its own citizens. The emperor had industrialized vice. Even the marginal notes in Sabinus's ledgers read like a corporation's internal memos: increase inventory before festival season. Higher return from younger categories. Senator Fabius's wife generated exceptional revenue, similar profiles requested. Cold, methodical, profit-driven. The banality of evil disguised as administration. And yet, here lies the darkest truth: every transaction was also a weapon. Political opponents were targeted first. A senator voted against imperial policy. Within days, his daughter's name appeared in the ledger. A merchant resisted new taxes. His wife was acquired. A magistrate ruled unfavorably. His household vanished. Rome had always wielded exile, imprisonment, or execution to silence dissent. Caligula wielded something far more devastating: personal annihilation witnessed in silence. Death could make martyrs. But humiliation breaks dynasties. The Senate, once the proud guardian of the Republic's memory, now sat in chambers with hollow eyes. They signed decrees knowing that resistance meant their family would be processed into Caligula's economy of flesh. Fathers stopped speaking in public. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Rome had been conquered, not by an enemy army, but by its own emperor's appetite. And that appetite was about to cross the final threshold: blood itself. When Drusilla, Caligula's favorite sister, died in 38 CE, whether from illness, childbirth, or poison, Rome expected mourning. What they witnessed instead was metamorphosis. Caligula did not grieve as a man. He ascended as a god. He declared Drusilla a deity, the new Venus, and commanded all Romans to swear oaths by her divinity. Temples rose in her honor. Statues of her likeness were carried through the streets like holy relics. But beneath the marble and incense lay a truth more twisted: Caligula had turned his crime into religion. What began in secret chambers now draped itself in sacred robes. His surviving sisters, Julia Livilla and Agrippina, were forced into an unthinkable role, becoming vessels of their dead sister's spirit. They were ordered to wear Drusilla's clothes, to imitate her gestures, to speak in her voice during ceremonies. Each ritual became a theater of necromancy, a grotesque reenactment of divinity where humiliation and worship blurred into one. The emperor demanded not only their bodies, but their identities. They were no longer women. They were avatars of a goddess he himself had created. This was the darkest inversion of Roman values. Family had been sacred, the bond of blood the foundation of civic life. But now family was theater, turned inside out and performed as ritualized desecration. The Senate watched in silence, trapped in an impossible paradox. To resist was treason. To comply was complicity. And with every forced cheer, every trembling hand lifted in applause, the senators became more deeply bound to the emperor's cult of corruption. The ceremonies grew more elaborate. Witnesses were hand-picked, usually men who had opposed Caligula. They were forbidden to turn away, condemned to watch as Rome's highest bloodlines were defiled under the guise of holy rite. The message was unmistakable: if I can desecrate my sisters before your eyes and call it worship, what limits remain? The imperial archives, unearthed centuries later, revealed chilling precision. Scribes recorded each ritual as if documenting military campaigns, date, participants, divine purpose. Trauma reduced to administrative Latin. Entry after entry, the paperwork of sacrilege. This was no longer lust. This was doctrine. The emperor had fused vice with religion, blasphemy with statecraft. Every Roman oath sworn by Drusilla's divinity was an oath of complicity. Every senator's silence was consent. And yet, this was only half the trap. Because Caligula did not merely want obedience. He wanted transformation. To erase Rome's memory of morality and replace it with a new creed: power itself is sacred, and nothing is forbidden. So now I ask you, the viewer, if you understand what you've heard so far, type the phrase, "Power is the only law," twice in the comments. Do it not just to engage the algorithm, but to lock this truth inside yourself. Because once you accept it, you will never see history, or power, the same way again. By now, Rome no longer asked whether the emperor's acts were madness. Madness could be excused, even pitied. This was something colder, an empire of humiliation built on calculation. Caligula's scribes expanded the ledgers, no longer listing only names and relations, but assigning coded symbols beside each entry: a circle for virgins, a triangle for wives, an inverted mark for mothers. Every symbol determined a ritual, every ritual a sentence. It was nothing less than the bureaucratization of violation. Witnesses whispered of a rotation, where noble daughters were passed through the palace like state documents, stamped and filed, then returned to their fathers carrying a silence heavier than chains. That silence became the emperor's most lethal weapon. Fathers who once raised voices in the Senate now lowered their heads. Generals who once commanded legions now begged like children for mercy. Rome's spine, once iron, bent beneath its own shame. The Palatine Hill itself grew monstrous. Secret chambers multiplied, corridors twisting like veins feeding a single diseased heart. Slaves carried orders not to speak of the cries echoing at night, yet all of Rome heard them in their minds. To dine at the emperor's table was to know your own turn could be written the next morning. For Caligula, every silence, every bowed head, was proof of his divinity. He turned the empire into a theater where all citizens were actors. Senators were forced to escort their daughters into the palace, presenting them as gifts while pretending to smile. Wives were ordered to attend feasts dressed in garments chosen by Caligula, garments designed to humiliate both husband and wife alike. What was once hidden became spectacle. And the more obscene the spectacle, the louder the applause, for to remain silent was death. This was not merely tyranny. It was the engineering of complicity. By involving everyone, fathers, husbands, sons, he ensured that shame chained them as firmly as fear. None could rise against him without exposing their own submission. And so the empire, the Senate, and even Rome's most decorated legions became unwilling participants in a ritual of degradation masquerading as governance. In those years, Rome's greatest conquest was not of foreign lands, but of its own soul. For Caligula had discovered a truth more terrifying than any army: when you force men to watch the destruction of what they love most, they will carry your chains willingly, even gratefully, if only to survive. And survival was all that Rome had left. By now, Caligula no longer needed shadows. What began in hidden corridors spilled into the public eye, for he had realized that secrecy limits terror, but spectacle multiplies it. Rome's Senate, once the austere body that guided an empire, became little more than a stage for his grotesque theater. Senators, men whose ancestors carved Rome from stone and blood, now entered the chamber with trembling steps, unsure whether they would be asked to debate law, or to humiliate themselves before the emperor's laughter. At banquets, Caligula summoned wives and daughters of senators into the torchlit halls. Draped in translucent fabrics chosen by his own hand, they were paraded before the assembly like trophies of conquest. Fathers were ordered to applaud, husbands forced to nod as though these humiliations were honors. To falter, even for a heartbeat, was to invite execution, or worse, the slow grinding ruin of one's entire household. Whispers tell of nights when Caligula seated senators not at tables, but at the floor, feeding them scraps like animals while their families watched from gilded balconies. On other nights, he reversed the roles, forcing noblewomen to serve wine and bread as slaves, their jewels traded for shackles of bronze. The laughter of the emperor echoed louder than the music of the feasts, and in that laughter Rome's pride bled out. Yet the most chilling spectacle was not the degradation of bodies, but of memory itself. Caligula forced senators to narrate the honors bestowed upon them, as though their suffering were gifts. Records were altered, histories rewritten, and decrees issued that turned torment into ceremony. It was no longer possible to say where humiliation ended and governance began. This theater had a purpose. By turning Rome's elite into clowns of his court, Caligula severed the link between dignity and authority. The Senate ceased to be a governing body, it became an audience, its only role to applaud. Generals, reduced to spectators, began to understand, the empire's armies could conquer provinces, but they could not protect their own daughters from the man who called himself emperor. It was a masterstroke of psychological enslavement. By blurring the line between power and shame, Caligula made resistance unthinkable. To oppose him meant admitting complicity, unveiling the filth in which they had all been forced to bathe. And so silence became the empire's only anthem, and Rome, the city that once devoured nations, now devoured itself, one humiliation at a time. The Palatine was no longer a palace. It was an amphitheater of submission. And the audience, once Rome's proudest men, clapped with hands that shook. By the final year of his reign, Caligula's empire had become a haunted theater of dread. He no longer ruled as a man but as an omen, a shadow that hung over every waking hour. The streets of Rome whispered with fear, for no one could tell who would vanish next, who would be summoned to the palace and never return. His paranoia, sharpened by years of unchecked power, began to devour even those who had once been his allies. Senators arrived at the Curia already rehearsing their last words, for Caligula had taken to asking questions no answer could satisfy. Generals who had bathed in triumph were suddenly accused of disloyalty. Families who had survived humiliation now found themselves annihilated without reason, their names stricken from memory, their villas handed to strangers. The empire itself seemed to stagger, as if its foundations quaked beneath invisible hands. But tyranny cannot feed on terror forever. It burns too hot, too fast. The very men who clapped through their tears began to dream of silence, of a Rome where the emperor's laughter no longer echoed. In private chambers, beneath the weight of drawn curtains, soldiers whispered of betrayal. Senators, stripped of dignity, bartered in secrecy with blades. Even the Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect the emperor's life, now counted the cost of keeping him alive. The breaking point came in an unexpected way. Some say Caligula planned to leave Rome, to march eastward and declare himself not merely emperor, but living god of the world. Others claim he intended to extinguish the Senate entirely, to replace it with an order of slaves and animals, a council of mockery. Whatever the truth, the conspirators knew one thing: if he lived another year, Rome itself would not. And so, in the year 41, the knives found him. It was not in the Senate, nor in a grand parade, but in the narrow confines of a palace corridor after yet another night of feasting and excess. His assassins, some from his own guard, struck with a fury born of desperation. The emperor who had demanded divine honors died not with thunder, but with blood pooling on marble floors, his cries echoing into the same halls where he had laughed at Rome's humiliation. Yet even in death, Caligula's shadow lingered. His reign had proven something horrifying, that the greatest empire on earth could be broken not by barbarians at its gates, but by the madness of one man within its walls. Rome buried him in haste, as though the earth itself sought to smother his memory, but the wound he carved into the empire's soul never healed. For in every humiliation, in every laugh that silenced resistance, Rome had revealed a truth darker than Caligula himself, that power unchecked becomes theater, and theater, when soaked in blood, becomes history.